What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hapnes, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is David Mead, and we speak about abilities, characteristics that help you bridge a trust gap, which are humanness, humility, and honesty. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy the show. Hello, David.
Hello, Miriam.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I am looking forward to speaking about facilitation and trust and bridging trust gaps with you. And before we get started, I always like to kick off with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
I do. I started in 2012. And it's interesting because before that, I'd had some other, facilitation experience, but I always referred to myself as a trainer. And there's a big difference to me, and as there may be to you as well. But trainer to me is really just it's more about whoever is presenting the information and getting information across so that people can do something, right? Mm-hmm. And facilitation is obviously much different. It's much more about who's in the room and creating the space. We'll talk more about that, but it turns the focus from the trainer to the facilitation and to the people in the room. So I feel like I made that switch in my mind, at least, and started calling myself a facilitator in 2012. What was the second question?
Whether you do. So you answered it.
I do. Yeah.
Nice.
I do.
And yes, you're right. I also see a very clear distinction between a trainer and facilitator. And somehow from what you say, there's this image popping up in my mind of the trainer taking space to fill it with content, as opposed to the facilitator who makes space for the group to fill it with content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember. It's funny because when you say it that way, it reminds me of a very, kind of my first job as a corporate trainer. And it was a small team. There were only three of us. There was a lady who ran the department, and then there was me and one other guy. And it was so funny because the guy trained me. And so I shouted him, and I went on, and these were 2-week long sales trainings, right? For salespeople. And I mean, just like the performance that guy put on for 2 weeks straight was so much about him taking up space in the room, and you leave thinking about the trainer.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Right. Whereas when I feel like when facilitation is done right, people leave thinking about what they've learned, what they've gotten out of it, how they can be better, what they think more about themselves rather than the person who created the experience for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Very right. They think about themselves and the group and everything that happened, but it's not about an individual, not about the person standing in front of the room.
Yeah.
So what made the change? Do you recall the moment where suddenly you stopped calling yourself a trainer and started a facilitator? Was it connected to a role that you were taking or to a mindset?
I think it probably started with the role, and then that shifted my mindset. And so my experience had been in this sort of sales environment where I was doing sales training, right? And then in 2012, that's right about the time that I started doing a lot of speaking and workshop facilitation for Simon Sinek when I joined his team. I joined his team in 2009, but the first couple of years was more sort of administrative stuff and answering emails and, creating content and that kind of stuff. But I really started getting in front of people in 2011, 2012. And I think it was a combination of the content and the idea, again, if you're not familiar with, for your listeners who might not be familiar with Simon's work, back in those days, it was really all around helping people discover their why, their purpose, what gets you out of bed in the morning, like the thing that inspires you, the thing that drives you. And it was so different than learning how to sell a product, which is what I had been doing before, right? And it was it was a lot more emotional. It was much more sort of about the person themselves, not about the skill that they were trying to build. And so just the nature of the conversation or the topic that we were discussing made me think a little bit differently about it is this has to be for them. This can't be about me, because I'm here to help them discover something about themselves. And I think just that turned into a mindset shift for me of I'm not showing up for me and what I need to say, or all of the content that I need to make sure that I cram down their throat so they know how to do something. It was really about, because everybody's different and everybody was in a different place, emotionally, or some people had thought about this idea of purpose and why a lot more than other people had. And so it was really about creating a space where I could meet everybody where they were and make sure that they got exactly what they needed out of the experience. And so I think it was the role first, and that created that shift in my mindset where I started to show up differently to those events.
This makes total sense. And I could tell my entire why story, but I'll leave this aside. What do you think now with your knowledge and your journey that you think that salespeople, so your previous you, could have learned from the facilitator you?
Absolutely. And it's really funny because a lot of the facilitation I did on Simon's work, I did with sales teams. So same people, just different context, right? I mean, I think there still is a place for, training. You have to learn skills and that kind of thing. But connecting those skills in a way that makes it personal to that person as to why do these skills matter, or what is learning these skills help you learn about yourself? Or, just turning it into something more than just information transfer, I think is what makes facilitation so rewarding and beneficial, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if I understand correctly, then it's a salesperson would help the person, the potential buyer, the client, to see the value for themselves in the product.
Yeah.
And
ultimately
facilitate the buying journey.
Right. Yeah. And I think when you understand more about yourself and how you connect with your own role as somebody in the audience, somebody who's participating, that's going to naturally flow when you sell something or present something or offer something to somebody else, because again, it's a shift in mindset. It's thinking about something differently. It's not a transaction anymore. It's how do we find a personal connection, or how do we identify with this thing somehow that is more meaningful than just the thing that we're selling.
Is there something that you have learned from your role as a trainer and a trainer in sales for facilitation?
Have a half-formed thought, and I'll say it out loud and see if I can make sense of it. One of the things that was sort of unfulfilling for me, and the reason that I liked the sales training that I did, but I didn't love it. And part of the reason that I didn't love it is because I would spend, with this company in particular, I would spend 2 weeks training these people on how to sell. This was Yellow Pages, it was phone books, right? Advertising in phone books, back when that was the thing. And I would spend 2 weeks giving them all this information that they needed to be successful in doing their job. And then the nature of sales being what it is, 3, 4, 5, 6 months later, they'd be gone. They'd be somewhere else because turnover is very high in sales positions. And I thought, man, all that time and effort and energy that I put into helping them learn this skill. So I think what I would take from that, and what I would maybe, if I could speak to my sales trainer self from a facilitator standpoint, would be try to do a little bit more to infuse something that they can take as a mindset shift, or something they can learn about themselves, something that no matter what role they happen to fill, whether they stay with this company or not, how can you help them instill more confidence in themselves? Or how can you help them to become a little better so that they wake up every day with a different mindset, or a different perspective on their life or their role, or what work can be, or what their relationships at work can be? So that no matter where they go, even if they do happen to leave, they still have something they can take with them that isn't lost. And that would have made me feel, I think, not that it's all about me, but that would have made me feel like I gave them something that transcended that job.
And maybe would have made them stay longer.
Maybe.
Because then if you feel that you're growing in your position, then you usually stay longer because you find it more fulfilling, right? And then you're more successful in the selling, and then it becomes a virtuous circle.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which makes me think of the distinction of teaching and facilitating learning. I mean, I think it's similar with training, right? You can train by teaching, by telling people what to do, or you can facilitate the learning journey of growing these skills that they would need on the job and get lots of personal growth alongside.
Yeah.
And in our exploration call, you were enthusiastic to share the topic of bridging the trust gap. And I'd be curious, what is it about this trust gap that fascinates you? What's the story behind that? And what do you mean by it?
So the context in which I talk about that normally is in the context of culture at work. And there's perhaps a little formula that helps to explain it. And it's something that my friend, he's a neuroscientist, named Jeb Hurley. He has a formula that says trust equals expectation plus experience. So often what happens, and again, I'll start from a sort of the cultural perspective, and then we can narrow in and talk about how this happens with facilitation. But a company will often advertise a particular culture, right? When they're prospecting, they're looking for new employees, they'll talk about how great the culture is and how, collaborative it is and how innovative it is and how we give you this and this and this. And, everybody loves to come to work, and all these positive expectations of the culture are set. And despite the great intentions that a lot of companies have, it's not that they're lying to people necessarily, but because of the pressures of, whether those are self-inflicted or externally inflicted, but pressures of performance or shareholder value or, all of these different day-to-day pressures that we face, especially if we're in a leadership role, often that culture that a company talks about is not the same culture that people actually experience. And that unexpected experience that people have causes this trust gap. So they say, well, man, when I joined this company, I was told this, this, and this, but I'm actually experiencing this, this, and this. So my expectation does not match my experience. And when that happens, that trust gap is formed. You say this, but you do this. When there's that inconsistency between what you say and what you do, or when you have specifically, for example, when you have a leader who is always talking about the company values, but then the way they behave is completely counter to those values.
Lack of integrity.
Yeah, that happens so often. And when we see that, we retreat into ourselves. We go into self-preservation mode and we think, I can't trust you. I don't know if what you say you're actually going to do. The company says that they stand for this, but the way that I see them treating this person over here, that was not in alignment with that. And so now how are they going to treat me? We close down, we protect ourselves, we protect information. We don't share, we don't collaborate, we don't communicate, we don't innovate because that requires, sharing ideas that might not work. We don't know how that's going to be received. We don't admit mistakes. All of these things cause this, are results, I should say, of this trust gap. So when we have that, if that gap is not bridged, we will never build trust. We will never have that human connection, and we will never have those things like the performance, the innovation, the collaboration, the communication that we're hoping to get on our teams. So that's the basic idea of this trust gap. So this can happen in facilitation as well, where if a company, does, periodic leadership training, for example, or leader development type of workshops, and you've had other colleagues that have gone to it and they come back and they say, wow, this is really great. And, had a great experience and learned a lot of things. We have this positive expectation, right? Going back to trust equals expectation plus experience, this expectation that has been set, we have in our minds. When we get there, if our experience doesn't match that positive expectation that's been set, maybe the facilitator's having an off day, right? Maybe they're maybe just personality wise, we just don't click with them or whatever it is. If our expectation doesn't match the experience that we have, then that trust gap can also happen in the room.
And it's very interesting what you're saying. And I would like to just yes and it, because I can even see two more applications where I would also observe it in the context of facilitation, where before workshop happens or training, where we set expectations, promising certain content, certain purpose, or a certain way of behavior where we are creative, where we yes, and each other, where everyone participates. And then suddenly this doesn't happen because there is one person who kills everyone with their PowerPoint presentation. Or after the workshop, where we create all these ideas, very participatory, where we exemplify a collaborative culture in this microverse of a workshop. And then afterwards, what happens? Nothing. Back to normal, to hierarchy, to command and control. And then, so we come out of a workshop with the expectation that something will change. And if then nothing changes, we do have a huge trust gap.
Excellent point, right? Especially when you have, for example, let's say you have your boss or a leader in the room who says, great, based on what we've done here today, we're going to do this, this, and this, which happens so often, right? We're going to charge ahead with this. This is going to be what we're going to do. And then, again, I don't want to fault their intention, but you go back out into where you came from and all of the same pressures are there. All of the same habits and systems are in place to where it just makes it difficult to all of a sudden change what you used to be doing before. And so nothing happens.
And we have so many positive emotions and hormones that we create in this time together, even online. We get all excited and we feel the collaboration, and then we believe in this better world. So I do believe that there are no bad intentions or false promises. It's just reality kicking in. It's like having a hangover after a party, right?
Yeah.
Everyone, for example, like, what did we decide? Who's cleaning up the mess? What do all the Post-it notes do here?
It's a great way to put it.
So when you now say bridging the gap, I would be very curious to hear from which end you'll bridge it, because you can either say, just let's lower the expectations and then we're all fine. Do you want to join this crappy organization? Our culture is shit. We don't trust each other. We don't collaborate.
That's an option. I mean, because then you know what you're signing up for. I don't want to mention any companies, but we know of some of these big companies that they are brutal places to work. And they spit people out every 6 months and they just keep hiring and firing people. And it's just like, it looks great on your resume, right? That you worked at this place. You will absolutely learn skills like grit and determination and all these things that can be really important. And if that's what that company is selling you, great. Sell it and say, you know what? We don't really have, any of the perks that other places have. We won't give you a free gym membership. We don't have kombucha bars. We don't have any of that stuff, but this is what you're going to get when you work here. If that's honest, great, do it. But don't pretend that you have this great culture, then bring people in and give them a horrible experience.
And what would be the other way to bridge the trust gap? Is basically to keep the promises, which is, I guess, the harder part.
Absolutely. And when you ask from which direction do you bridge the gap, it's actually a really interesting question. And I think the responsibility lies with, and it doesn't have to be somebody in leadership necessarily, but I would say the responsibility lies with the person who created the gap to begin with, right? If you're on the receiving end of the gap, you can try to have a conversation about it, but unless the other person takes responsibility for what they've done and the gap that they've created, it's not really going to do anything. And so what bridges the gap is maybe a natural place to go, right? And I'll give you just a little bit of background as to where this idea came from. I made a list and I thought about all of the leaders that I've had, whether they're in official positions of leadership or not, but people who I chose to follow and people who I see as leaders. And I wrote down what are the characteristics or the attributes that these people have. And there were a couple of dozen probably that I came up with. I thought that's a lot to remember. Nobody will ever remember all those things. So how do I sort of boil that down into something that's a little bit more memorable? And I found that nearly all, if not all of those attributes really boil down to 3 traits, which are honest, humble, and human. And of course, they have the sort of the dictionary definition versions of them, but I go a little bit deeper on some of these. So honest, for example, is the way I define an honest person is somebody who behaves in line with what they say they stand for, first of all. And when they veer off course a little bit, and we all do because of different pressures that we face, they are willing to take responsibility for that action and say, you know what, I will own my part of that. Okay, that's what I mean by honest. Humble is the traditional, dropping your ego and that kind of thing. But to me, it's more than that. It's about having a healthy relationship with your ego, because we can't get rid of our ego. It's always going to be there. But it's looking at really two things. First, it's being able to admit our weakness without getting defensive, because when a weakness is presented to us, the first thing we generally do is try to defend ourselves, right? So humility is really about being able to look at that objectively without getting defensive about it. And importantly, also recognizing our strengths without letting ego get in the way. Mm-hmm. So humility is not about meekness or weakness, or I'm not good enough, or I'm less than that. It's none of that. Humility is about recognizing and saying, you know what, I have a strength here. I have a gift or a talent, and I've been put in a position of leadership because of that. What an amazing opportunity that is for me to help other people, to share that and to lift other people up, and to make our strengths not about us, but about other people and how we can help those other people. So that's kind of how I define humility. Then the human element is having a genuine concern and care for the experience that we create for other people, whether that's at work or at home or whatever it is, helping people to feel their value, whatever that is, helping them to feel valuable, helping them to feel like they're a part of something that matters. And so again, I took all of these traits and they all seem to sort of fall under that umbrella of honest, humble, and human. And if you think about it in a sense of, we've got this trust gap, right? I've done something, I've behaved in a way that goes against what your positive expectation of me was, that expectation that I set, right? So how do I bridge that gap? Well, first of all, I'm honest about it. And I acknowledge to myself that, you know what, I did something that was not at my best. And then I tell that person, I know that I did something that I shouldn't have done. I know that I'm going to own my part of that. Humble comes in where I recognize, you know what, something like this is probably going to come up again. I have something to learn from this. I can do better. I can be better than I have been. And the human element is so incredibly important, because you can't just have one or two of these. You have to have all three. I compare it to concrete, right? Concrete has a few simple ingredients, but if you leave one of those ingredients out, it doesn't hold together. So this is the same thing with honest, humble, and human. You have to have all three. So the human part is connecting with that person, recognizing the way that our behavior affected them and made them feel, and apologizing and trying to form that connection and repair what has been lost. And if it helps, I'll give you an example of how this played out. Can I give you an example?
Absolutely.
Okay. So simple example. And again, these don't have to be big things. These are things that can often happen to us just on a daily basis, but we sometimes don't think about them in this context. So it was about 5 or 6 years ago. I was on Simon Sinek's team at the time, and we were on a retreat with our team for a few days. And my friend Peter, who was on the team as well, we were asked to co-facilitate a half-day session for our team. And I noticed that the first time after I was done presenting my part of it, he came up to do his piece. But before he started in on his content, he spent 2, 3, 4 minutes saying more about what I had said and building on it and sharing more experiences and all this kind of stuff. And I didn't think about it at first, because Peter's a really smart guy and everything he was saying was absolutely relevant. But this happened every single time I got done sharing my bit of content. He would come and add to it and sort of build on it and share more and more and more and more. And I found myself actually starting to share less and less and less when it was my turn to speak, because I knew he was just going to come and say more and more and more after I was done. And I've never experienced Peter like this before. And it sort of caused this weird little, I didn't call it a trust gap at the time. I didn't have that language, but there was just this, I don't know, it was just like, it made it awkward to be around him for the next day or two for the rest of the retreat. And he had unknowingly created this trust gap where all of a sudden now something was different. I was like, why did you do that? And it really affected my confidence, and it affected the skill that I thought I had as a facilitator. And it made me wonder, does he really not think that I'm able to talk about these things in an intelligent way? And it just like, caused this weirdness in our relationship, right? So we happened to share a car back to the airport, a rental car back to the airport after the retreat was over. And I sat there staring out the window and I thought, do I say something or do I just let it go? Because maybe he was just having an off day. I don't know. But I decided to say something. And so I brought this to his attention, and immediately, and again, I didn't have the language of honest, humble, and human at the time, But immediately he hit all of those things to bridge that gap. First, he acknowledged that that's what he had done. He said, you know what, you're right. I did do that. And I didn't even think about it at the time, but I know that I did that. And he was humble about it and said he was mortified. Even now, when I bring it up, he feels so awful about it. But he recognized that that was not the way that he should have handled that situation and that he had something to learn for next time. And then importantly, he really identified, and we spent most of the time talking about how it had affected me and how it had affected my confidence and how it made me feel. And he really empathized and understood where I was coming from. And had he left that part out, he could have been honest and he could have been humble, but if he hadn't been human, it wouldn't have bridged the gap, right? Or he could have just apologized and said, you know what, gosh, I'm really sorry that I made you feel that way. But if he hadn't admitted that he had done it or that he had learned something from it and it was going to change his behavior, the gap would not have been bridged. And so again, it's these simple things. We had a great conversation and now our relationship is better than ever because we had that, and that relationship or that bridge has been built over that gap. So that's just a simple example of how these things come into play when we've created that unexpected experience for other people.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a beautiful example on so many levels that are relevant for facilitation in terms of collaborating with someone, open communication and feedback when we care. And then, what are the qualities to actually own the feedback when it's critical? And how to, as you say, bridge the trust gap. I totally get the point.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag and drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
I would be curious to hear how you can apply this on group work even. Would it be a tool that you use on leadership training? So someone who has created the gap, as you mentioned it, then owns it and bridges it ex post? Or is it something that you can also do in group work?
Say more about what you mean by group work.
I'm thinking of all the dynamics that happen when we work with groups.
So like when you're working on a project with people, for example?
Or in a workshop where suddenly you feel this elephant in the room, right? So something is happening. Maybe you promised something before, and then you realize that actually, as it is, it's not. Is it then something that the facilitator has to own and then guide the group through the gap? Is it that as a facilitator, it's then my role to show that this honesty, humility, and humanness to create the connection to the group and to the affected, and to basically help the leader to bridge that?
I mean, in the context of facilitating a group, this has happened to me a few times, not many, but a few times when, for example, the context is I would be helping a team or a small organization to discover and articulate their why, right? And it was terrifying every time I did it because every group is different and you're never sure if you're going to get there or not because you've got, 4 to 6 hours maybe. And it was terrifying every time. And most of the time we got there, at least to the point where they had something workable where they could, it was a matter of refining it or tweaking the language a little bit. But there were a couple of times where I could tell we were just not going to get there. And the group could feel it too. Like we had, 8 different options to choose from, and half the room wanted, really like this one, and a third of the room like this one. And, it was just a mess. And to your point, like that becomes an elephant in the room where people are looking at their watches and they think we only have an hour and a half left and there is no way we're going to get there. And I'm up there sweating because I know we're not going to get there.
Love the example. Mm-hmm.
And so this is absolutely a time where those things come in, and again, the context can be different depending on the group and the situation, but it's either something that I would have a conversation with everybody in front of the room, or on a break, I would pull the leader aside and I would say, hey, here's where we're at. Honest, right? I'm owning the fact that we might not get there. And there's some things maybe that I could have done a little bit differently. Maybe I let the conversation go on too long, or I tried to please too many people and, tried to, rather than really go with my gut, I sort of let too many voices in. And so we got to this place where we're not going to get there. I'm sorry about that. I want to make sure that you have a great experience, dropping my ego and rather than being, I have all the answers, I'm the facilitator, we're going to get there. You know what? We might not get there today. But because I want to make sure that this is a positive experience, because that's what it's all about, here are the options. I'm happy to, after the event, we can jump on a conference call for another 2 hours and work through this, or whatever the solution is, to make sure that they feel like this isn't just a job and when it's over, I'm going to collect my paycheck and go home, but I have a genuine care for the experience that they're getting. And if they didn't get that experience in the room, how can I then make up for it and find another solution to fulfill on that experience that they were expecting?
I love the example on so many levels. So one, it shows how the facilitator can really use these 3 characteristics that you mentioned to let the trust gap not emerge, basically, right? So to get the elephant out before it destroys the china. On the other hand, or on a deeper level, what I like about this example is the question, what is our responsibility as a trainer, as a facilitator, to get the group there? So what is the honest part I get, the human part I get in this exercise? So the honest one, we might not get there. That's a fact. The human part of, I empathize with you. This is, I promised you that. You as the leader, you bought that, and you might also feel terrible that you're wasting or that you're not finding your why. I mean, what kind of doubts might the leader have that their team is not going to find their why despite a bulletproof process? But then where would you draw the line that it's really your responsibility? Because it is a bulletproof process. It has worked with almost all the other teams. And at the end of the day, you cannot force them to be creative. As you said, the difference between a trainer and a facilitator is that you provide the space for the group to come up with whatever they need.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you brought up the honest and the human with examples or potential things that I, as a facilitator, might say. Mm-hmm. The humble piece, these are not necessarily things that have to be said. Mm-hmm. It can be the way that we show up, right? And so on that humble part specifically, and it might come out in the words that I speak or the way that I say them, but if I were to show up as if like, this is a bulletproof process and it's going to work. And even though in my head, I'm thinking, you know what, they're never going to get there. That is a disconnect in humility, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's more in the demeanor or in the way that we show up, or how do we present ourselves as we're coming up with that solution. Are we going to stick to our ego and say, nope, I've done this, 150 times. It's going to work. We've only got an hour and a half, but it's going to happen. And that positive thinking is fine. But in case we don't, being willing to say, or being willing to come across as if, you know what, I'm not perfect. I don't always, we don't always get there. And it's not about owning everything. Because like you said, they have a responsibility as well. And if they didn't show up, if they're on their phones rather than actually participating, if they're not there 100%, we're not going to get there. But it's owning your part and allowing them to own theirs.
Yeah.
Right. And here's another thing that's really important is you mentioned something a couple minutes ago about addressing the elephant in the room so that before the trust gap even, is created. Mm-hmm. These traits of honest, humble, and human. And obviously they come along with specific practices and behaviors. You can't just be humble. You have to practice that through certain behaviors and the way that you live. But these three things are not just things that we pull out when that trust gap has been created. The idea is to make this a daily pursuit, that we try always to show up in every interaction that we have, in every conversation that we have, as honest, humble, and human. When we do that, we're less likely to create those trust gaps. But because we're human and imperfect, we still will every once in a while. And then we can use those tools to bridge the gap. But more importantly is, how do we reduce the frequency of those trust gaps because we just simply show up in this way more often?
Absolutely. And also, I think they're like a protective shield, because without these three, we then quickly get into a blaming game, right? Because it's one thing to talk about who owns the results or the outcomes of a creative process, where, to be honest, we can never guarantee. And who are we to judge the quality? Sometimes we only find out how successful a session was only weeks or months later. But then if we try to hide behind ego, if we don't dare to be honest, humble, and human, then it will quickly go, oh, your team didn't work hard enough, if you weren't on the phone, or if you only prepared better, maybe your process isn't as bulletproof as you pretend to be.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think when we let those egos flare up, it's easier to sort of throw those darts, right? Because we don't like people that let their ego out. Yeah. And it's easier to be critical of them or to, find fault. But when there's somebody who genuinely shows up and you can tell that they really care about you and the process that you're going through, we let that guard down a little bit and we're more willing. Oh, they're owning their piece of that. They're recognizing what they could have done better. Not always, but that generally tends to allow people to reflect on, okay, what's my part? Yeah, I was on my phone. I was more worried about my email than I was about being really present for the process. Doesn't fix the problem, but at least that way we can move forward in a way that, like, okay, if we're going to continue to do this, we need to both need to make some changes to make sure that we get the experience that we want.
And I will ask the obvious question in a bit, and I park it right here. And before that, I ask you, what makes a workshop fail? And because I think it's the right moment to ask that one as well. And what I have in mind is, you having given the same kind of workshop so many times, is there something that you have recognized, a pattern that makes it fail?
Yes. And I think it goes back to the conversation of the difference between trainer and facilitator, is when I walk in with the mindset of, I have to get this, and this across. And it's about what I'm going to share, not about the experience that I'm going to create. This is one of the things that I learned pretty recently about myself, is I have a perfectionist streak where if I'm going to do something, it is going to be as close to perfect as it can be. But somebody brought up a really interesting point, and they said the people in the room have no idea what your version of perfect is. So stop thinking about yourself and focus more on, how can I create a space where people can get out of this experience exactly what they need to get out of it? Because that is going to be what's perfect for them. So forget about what your perfect is. That doesn't mean show up and be sloppy, but rather than worrying so much about, it's going to go like this, and then I'm going to say this, and then we're going to do this, and then this activity is going to turn out just like this, and it's going to cause this response and this reaction, yourself, and think more about them and the experience that you're creating.
That makes a lot of sense. And how can you create the space for the people to show up with all their imperfections? Because this is what will then create this creative spark, right?
Yeah, and showing up, being willing to, in an appropriate way, share your own imperfections.
Yeah.
That's a lot of this honest, humble, and human stuff sort of melds into each other, but that is honest, that is humble, and that is human. That's what creates that connection with the people in the room, is when they realize, wow, this guy doesn't think he knows it all.
And isn't imperfection the most beautiful trait that is humble, human, and honest at the same time?
Yeah. Fantastic.
And which brings me to the question that I parked here. Is it a skill set that we can actually learn? Or is it something that grows with integrity, with maybe maturity, with age? Or is it something that we have or we don't have?
Oh, that is such a simple but complex question, because here's what I believe. I do believe that, first of all, we all have these traits within us, honest, humble, and human to some extent. In some people, it's just buried a little bit further than with others. But I believe that it is inside of all of us. When we are put into a position, I mean, again, think of it outside of the context of work. But when we're in a relationship with somebody we genuinely care about, whether it's a spouse or a partner or kids or, a best friend, when we genuinely care about somebody and something happens that, we create this trust gap, if that relationship matters enough to us, we will dig out those things and we will display those traits of honest, humble, and human to help to repair what has been damaged.
Like an instinct.
Yeah. And so I believe that we all have it in there somewhere, but being intentional about it is very different. And I think a lot of it does come with maturity, and it does come with practice, and it does come with awareness and intentionality. And just because we have them in there doesn't mean that they're always going to pop out. But I think this is where what I said before, it has to be a daily practice, because there's so many things that, for better or worse, keep those things buried, right? And they whether it would be, we're afraid that if we don't pretend like we know it all, we're going to lose our job, or people are not going to trust us, or they're not going to think we're competent, or whatever all these things are. And so we let our ego flare up, for example, and that humility gets buried a little bit more each day when we feel like we have to let our ego lead our lives, right? So it's all in there, but it's how aware and how intentional and how mature are we to be able to do the uncomfortable work of developing them.
So it's not about a skill that we have to learn, but an instinct that we have to revive and to remove all the layers that are protecting us, or these false beliefs.
That's
Makes
part
sense.
of it. Yeah.
Makes sense.
I think to your point, it is though a skill that can be built, because like I said, all of these traits are tied to behavior. We can't just decide to be human. I mean, like, we have to do certain things. How do, like, for example, if you're a leader on a team, for example, when somebody on your team crosses your mind, you send them a text and you just say, hey, you just crossed my mind. I was thinking about you. I hope you're doing okay. Just let me know how you're doing. That is a behavior that makes other people define you as a human leader, right? These are not things we can call ourselves. I'm humble. Really? It doesn't work. These are not things we can ascribe to ourselves. These are things that we strive to be, but they're only true when other people call us those things, when other people's experience of us is those things. So the skills part is developing the behaviors and the habits and the practice of doing those things. Those things can be learned.
Yeah. And I wondered to what extent it relates to the umbrella of vulnerability, which is maybe a term that is a bit overused by now. And still, I think it's by vulnerability is the state in which we dare to show our imperfections, where we dare to admit that we've been wrong, where we dare to admit our fears. So all these, where we pull away all these layers that prevent us from being honest, human, and humble.
Absolutely right.
And I tend to believe that these are also the three skills that I think, especially as facilitators, we have to excel, because we're constantly in charge of bridging the trust gap for others, right?
Mm-hmm. Or ensuring that it's not created, right?
That's true. Do you have something to share, maybe an exercise? How can we, like a gym, to practice humanness, humility, and honesty?
So a couple of things come to mind. One is not going with my definitions necessarily, but when you think about those traits, what I recommend that people do, and I do this as an exercise sometimes in a workshop, is think of the best leader you've ever had. Could be at work, could be a coach, it could be a mentor, it could be a parent, whoever you think of as the best leader you've had, and define their characteristics. What traits and characteristics make them the kind of person that popped into your mind when I asked that question? And then, how do those things perhaps fall under the construct of honest, humble, and human? Where would you put those characteristics? And then what did they do specifically? How did they behave that makes you call them honest, humble, or human, right? Mm-hmm. And so identifying those behaviors and then thinking with that construct in mind, because every person is different, what does that mean for you? How do you show up? What do you do when you are honest, humble, and human? So first is identifying what do those behaviors actually look like, because you don't know what the behaviors are, you can't do them. The second thing that I have found so helpful is what are called triggers. And a couple of people have talked about this, but James Clear, he wrote the book Atomic Habits. But these are the things that can help so much. And Brendan Burchard is another one who talks a lot about how can you make sure that you're actually implementing these things? Because when you haven't been doing them and all of a sudden you decide, I'm going to behave in ways that are more honest, humble, and human, it's hard. You have to create new habits. And so these triggers are so important. So for example, one of my triggers is every time I walk through a doorway, I remind myself to do something. Or whenever I sit down in my office chair, I remind myself to do something. When I hang my towel up before I go take a shower, that's a trigger for me to remember something or to do something. And so when we can have these triggers that every time this thing happens, which happens every day or multiple times a day, that triggers me doing a behavior or thinking about somebody in a certain way, that's a great way to start building those new habits that will help us to become more honest, humble, and human.
I love that. And it could even become a team ritual where what if after each team meeting, one person just summarizes the honest, humble, and human behavior they have observed in their teammates in that meeting?
Awesome. Another thing that works really well on a team is an accountability partner.
Yes.
So you pick another person and every week you have a quick 10, 15-minute check-in of, hey, how are you doing on your honest, humble, and human behaviors? What are they? Give me a time this week when you've done one of those things. Where's a time where you realize that you didn't, right? When we're accountable to somebody else, that helps us to instill those new behaviors too.
Yeah. And thinking what can become possible if you become this person. So really the vision, the purpose, why we're back to the why we're actually doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I talk about this in the context of work most of the time, just because that's where most people spend a lot of their time. But this is not about becoming a better, leader at work or becoming a better, person at work. This is just human stuff. And this translates to every relationship that we have. And the ultimate outcome of, why are we doing this stuff is because that is what builds trust and human connection. And at the end of the day, what's more important than that?
Yeah, it makes us better humans. And that's something interesting that I've observed in the community of facilitators. And I think coaches and most of the trainers fall in the same bucket. We are deeply concerned with personal growth, which goes hand in hand with professional growth. Because as long as we don't deal with our own shit, we won't be able to help anyone outside there.
Right.
So we have to have these three things under control. Yeah. And therefore to have an accountability partner in working on these habits makes a lot of sense to me. I cannot not ask the question, what is your why?
My why is to propel people to do a little better and be a little better than they were yesterday.
Is there anything, we've talked about the trust gap and the audience are mostly facilitators, team leaders, coaches. What would be the one advice you would give them?
I think we've talked a lot about it and we've sort of, danced around it a little bit and we've said it in different ways. But the one piece of advice I would give is to show up as yourself. I mean, I have received zero professional training to speak or to facilitate workshops. I'm not saying that's the right way to go. What I have found, though, is that often when I've seen others who have had a lot of that training, sometimes that can lead to them showing up as a trainer or as a facilitator rather than showing up as Miriam or David or Paul or Jeanette. Just when people can feel you with all of your brilliance and all of your imperfections and all of your just messiness, that's what connects people to each other. They want to know a real person. The performance, they want somebody who understands them, who empathizes with them, who cares about them, and who is there doing it for more than
the job.
That's for more than a job.
Yeah. Thank you for the reminder. I think that's very true. And the connection you're making with the training that we get. So the more, like, it's an inverted U, no, it is a U shape where we can be very authentic in ourselves if we have zero training, like children. Right?
Yeah.
They're the fullest version of themselves, and there's nothing else they know, right?
Right.
They can play mommy and daddy, but and then we get more training and we lose of this authenticity, because then suddenly we get, this is how you should do it. And this is the textbook. And then we lose this kind of trusting our own way of doing. We want to copy. And then at some point we can go up again once we master all the content and we make it our own.
Yeah.
Then we get back into this authenticity and into owning it and being ourselves.
Yeah, I love that idea, because it's not about not having training that makes you authentic. It's about having all of that and yet being so proficient at it that it doesn't get in the way of your being you.
Yeah. Wonderful. Is there anything that you'd like to share that we haven't touched upon yet?
I think it relates a little bit to what I'm talking about, but if there could be a second piece of advice that I might share, and this is something that I have found particularly useful, and I got this from Simon Sinek, but and I think I've only forgotten once in 12 years of doing this, but every time before I would step on a stage or turn on Zoom for a virtual event or whatever it is, I tell myself in my head, show up to give. And that's just something that as a constant reminder that it's not about me. How can I create that space and create that environment? And just another thing I think about is like, how can I just hug them with my heart? You know what I mean? How do I make it about them? It doesn't necessarily change what I do. I'm still going to facilitate the way that I had probably come and planned, unless something goes completely wrong. But it changes the way I show up. And it ensures that my mindset is in the right place.
Thank you for that one.
Yeah.
Good advice. Yeah. Show up to share, to serve for them. Yeah. Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Had some really thoughtful questions and comments that made me.
Thank you. I'm sure the audience as well made me think.
Yeah.
Lots.
Yeah. We have a really special opportunity in what we do, don't we?
Yes.
To affect a lot of people in a lot of good ways.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think many have the opportunity, but they're not using it yet. So in my world, I have the impression that every manager, leader could be a facilitator, could have this impact, could show up, as you just described it, with humility and humanness and honesty, and thereby have an impact on themselves and people around them. And then it becomes a choice, right?
Yeah. And you bring up a great point too, which is, like expanding the mindset of facilitation, right? It doesn't mean that you're giving a training. It's how are you facilitating a meeting? How are you facilitating a conversation, a 360, a one-on-one, a performance review? All these things are facilitation,
Yeah. And how do you bring it outside of work into your own life, to your private life without, and I think that's the thing that makes it different. I talked recently with many podcast guests about the fact that somehow we get the comments from our friends, stop being a facilitator. Stop being a coach. Don't ask me why.
Yeah.
And I think it's exactly what you just mentioned as your second piece of advice, where it only sounds weird or forced, and we get this comment if we're not being our full self when we're doing this. We're wearing a mask of the trainer, the coach, the facilitator.
That's when you're in the bottom of the U, right?
Yeah.
That's where you're focused.
Yeah. And then once we let that go and we really incorporate it because it became a habit, it became part of us, then we won't get this comment anymore. You just gave me this piece of the puzzle.
Good.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It was fun.
Yes.
Good conversation.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.